Stop. This message could save you from investing your precious time into a true crime story that goes nowhere. Avoid that disappointment. You need True Crime Feed Podcast. Unlimited premium true crime curated for you. Find out about a female serial dater turned serial killer. The truth about the DARE program. Bizarre black markets, political murder plots, and a school for troubled teens so horrific it could be a Stephen King novel. True Crime Feed sifts through the archives from the past decade to select the best cases and gives you a quick overview sprinkled with a teensy bit of humor. Plus, a weekly top 3 power ranking for shows currently trending. And lets you know what shows to send down your podcast queue trapdoor. You know you want those thrill chills, so come and get them. Subscribe to True Crime Feed. That's True Crime FEED wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to the Twisted Mirror. This episode took a little bit longer to release than I had anticipated due to a hot tea incident with my laptop. But I'm also taking a bit of a planned extended break before the season finale. Then after the finale, Twisted Mirror will be gone during the summer while I prep for the next season. If you want to stay in the loop, you can follow Twisted Mirror on Facebook, IG, or TikTok. Just type in Twisted Mirror or get the links from the show notes. I'll still be active on Patreon during the break, so it's a good time to head over there for bonus content. And if you want to hit up a quick link for all things Twisted Mirror, go to twistedmirrorpodcast.com where there are links to merch, socials, and ways to donate. All right, you've waited long enough for this one. On to The Itch.
You are now staring into the Twisted Mirror.
We fear what goes bump in the night. It's part of being human. It's an instinct that has ensured our survival since the dawn of man. A random noise in your house at night, the rustling of bushes while on a camping trip. Just a small change in our environment will sound our primordial alarm system. We fear the predator, the invader, the unknown entity coming to take what's ours, be it our possessions, our family, our very lives. But there is a monster that can sneak by any alarm system, any guard, any complicated set of locks. And that is the one that may be lurking inside of you. A mutation that suddenly makes healthy cells produce tumors. Your own internal security system, your immune cells, might one day attack the very body it was designed to protect. When your body turns on you, there is nowhere you can run. There is no safe place. There is no number you can call to remove the enemy. Rarely will people rally around you like they might if some crazed maniac had attacked you. At the end of the day, it's always you with yourself. If you're lucky, a doctor can find a way to stem the mutiny. But it's a tricky thing, attacking the very body you are trying to save. There's almost always a cost in the process. I used to go for late night walks, alone. That may seem unusual for a woman, but there's a reason behind it. I live in a mid-sized city. I won't disclose the name for privacy reasons. It's the kind of city that is pretty lively during the day, but aside from a few strips of bars and restaurants, turned into a ghost town after hours. The kind of city that does sleep. I didn't walk for the joy of it or because I'm some vigilante looking to spot crime. No, the reason is much less exciting or badass. It's because I'm allergic to sleep. I know it sounds absurd, and I guess it's not literal, but for all practical purposes, I am. About 3 years ago, one night I did the usual routine. I kissed my boyfriend goodnight, nuzzled myself into his armpit, and fell asleep. And woke up at around 3 a.m. to a burning itch. That last part was not the usual. I dragged my butt out of bed, walked into the bathroom, and switched on the lights. Honestly, nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. I, a person who had not so much as a sniffle from pollen my entire life or a single known allergy, was covered from the neck down in hives. A huge network of raised wheels that connected to each other like a raised topographical map. Naturally, I freaked out. My first thought was everyone's urban nightmare, bed bugs. So I frantically woke up Julian, ripping off the sheets as he tried to make sense of my ramblings about checking the covers and the corners of the bed for little black spots. But after a thorough examination and much Googling, we determined we didn't have an infestation. At the time, it was a relief. Looking back now, I wish the answer was that simple. So next, I thought it must have been something I ate or some sort of allergic reaction to a random bug bite. Maybe I was no longer tolerating our scented laundry detergent. It was a fluke, a nuisance that would work itself out in a few quick changes. So that day, I grabbed new scentless detergent, shampoo, all the usual suspects. I drank a ton of water, and the breakout subsided as the day progressed. I figured this fit of my immune system would pass and that the hardest part of this whole thing would be missing that fresh scent of newly washed sheets. I went to bed that night with no anxiety about the matter. Then I woke up in the middle of the night, again, covered in these inflamed, unsightly welts. They were even worse than the night before. Angry is the only way to describe the mounds of red, hot skin that seemed to pop up like a game of whack-a-mole. One hive would go down and then a new one would pop up elsewhere. It's that ferocious itch you can't scratch, at the bottom of your shoe or that perfectly unreachable spot on your back, the one that stops you dead in your tracks, demanding to be addressed before anything else. Except it's everywhere, all over, and evades you like it has a mind of its own. Scratching only provided a moment's relief, and sometimes it only made my skin react more. Over time, it would become scarred from the open cuts and scratches at my own hands. So began the doctor's appointments. Especially if you're a woman, you've likely run across it before. The constant dismissal of my chronic discomfort and pain. Being told I would have to wait months to be seen, and then months to see specialists. The lack of compassion from some doctors who only had a few minutes to discuss my growing symptoms and didn't see the worst of it. How I would wake up consumed by a feeling of perpetual doom, sick to my stomach, my body deformed and on fire. They insisted it must be something I ate or it was my cat Pinto Beans, but Pinto Beans didn't sleep with us when the breakouts were their worst. I remember trying to explain how when the hives were at their peak, other parts of me felt off. We're talking about your skin right now, the doctor said. You'll have to set another appointment to talk about your stomach issues, or I can refer you to a gastro. Ah yes, another few months of agony waiting to be seen as my body and mind deteriorated, as if I only existed in separate parts and did not consist of a complex network of systems. As I waited, desperate for relief, I eliminated food after food until all I ate was rice and potatoes. Even when I traveled, no matter where the bed was, I would wake up, a fire from within tearing me out of my slumber. There was only one common denominator, one thing that guaranteed the eruption would return with a vengeance: the daily, unavoidable task of sleep. I'd crawl message boards and social media groups to find people with stories similar to mine, and yet many were just as lost. Sometimes someone would finally get an obscure diagnosis after years of doing their own research and insisting on certain tests, going from doctor to doctor and being labeled as a difficult patient. Someone would find a vitamin or a supplement that worked for them. But there were many diagnoses, many home remedies, and what worked for one person did not for the next. It was all so overwhelming. On good days, things seemed to slowly die down to a tolerable level by mid-afternoon, and then as soon as I slipped into what should be a restorative sleep, I would wake up feeling like I was in flames. There were nights in the beginning when I went to bed feeling this might be the day I would finally wake up rested and back to the person I was before that first night. The doctor said cases can resolve spontaneously within a year. But every night, as sure as the sun set and the moon rose, so they came. I don't feel that hope anymore. I learned after a few months that it only magnified the despair. And not only did the hives not resolve, they worsened over time. Eventually, after endless phone calls trying to see specialists, thousands spent on medical bills and supplements, suffering patiently as I waited months between appointments, begging doctors for certain tests, being talked down to as some paranoid idiot who read a little too much WebMD, so casual the medical system was with my pain, a doctor threw a diagnosis at me. There wasn't a known cause for my condition. My blood work, at least based on the labs they agreed to, was deemed normal. The doctor said it was probably an autoimmune response, but there was no distinct cause they could identify. That it wasn't some outside invader that was causing these sleepless nights. It was my own body turning against itself. Here's some steroids, see you in a few months. Oh, by the way, they'll make you feel awful and you'll gain 100 pounds. Now, go on, people are dying, Nikki. I'd always assumed they had this stuff mapped out, that they knew all the ways in which your body could attack itself, and they'd at least give you an answer if they couldn't throw a pill at you to solve it. But apparently there are countless ways it can happen. Many they haven't even identified yet. So many ways your life can be ruined. Ways you can't even fathom until it happens to you. Chronic spontaneous urticaria. That's what they told me. I'll break it down for you. It's a fancy way of saying, yes, you have hives, aka urticaria. They are chronic, and we don't know why. That's the spontaneous part. We can't tell you when they'll stop. It could be weeks, it could be days, it could be years, or maybe even decades. I was so tired of searching. At least I had a name for it now. And with the diagnosis, there was renewed hope for a brief period. There were some new meds to try. We were past the basic OTCs that was like trying to shoot a toy arrow at Godzilla. We moved to the newer miracle drugs, one that even had the potential side effect of turning me into a suicidal rage monster. I was so desperate for one night of unbroken sleep, one morning, just one, to remind me of the person I used to be. But it never happened. My case was deemed refractory to medication. What do you do? Where do you go after that? In some ways, I was lucky. Some people's condition gets to the point where their throat swells, their breathing swallows, their Blood pressure plummets, a type of anaphylaxis. In other ways, I wasn't. As time went on, along with the hives came its sister ailment, angioedema. Some mornings I would wake up to the expected burning and tingling, and then I'd look in the mirror to see my lips swollen to twice their size. Sometimes my fingers and knees would swell. They would stiffen and throb under the choke of the fluid surrounding them. I used to have beautiful skin. I don't say that in a boastful way. I say it because I mourn it. My skin is marked and scarred from the years of trying to make the intolerable itch go away. And even though the raised snaking wheels sometimes settle as the days wear on, their shadows remain. Red and brown mottled skin is left behind, and I feel the inflammation just beneath the surface, like there is something possessing me, reminding me that the monster inside of me is lurking, waiting for me to close my eyes, to get some measure of rest so that it can attack. I am a host now to this mystery ailment. I am its vessel. My needs are secondary to it. When I look in the mirror, I see someone who has aged years beyond the 3 that have passed. My once clear face is red and blotchy, my eyes sunken, hollow and rimmed with dark gray circles. Lines have settled where there once were none. I don't know if it's from the illness, a lack of sleep, or stress. What does it even matter when they all feed into each other? Now I am invisible to society, a woman past her prime. My world became a solitary bubble, scared to eat out or go to new places, afraid some unknown, unseen trigger might just agitate my chaotic immune system. Scared to meet new people because I didn't want them to meet this version of me, a person who had confined herself to her home, who only ventures out when absolutely necessary. I got so sick of hearing myself speak to those who care about me. I became a broken record, the permanently ill. I used to have so much to talk about, but now my world is itchy, swollen, angry. I can see it in their eyes. They care, up until a point. Then they just want you to shut up about it, to get over it. It's just a rash, after all. On bad days when the hives didn't settle as much, or my lips grew into misshapen blobs, coworkers would try to avert their eyes. Strangers would make sure to sit far away on public transportation like I was some sort of leper. Maybe you're listening to this, and you think, what a crybaby. I'm ashamed to admit that maybe I thought that about other people suffering from chronic illness too. But until your body turns on you, until your very flesh becomes a painful, unsolvable mystery, you would not understand the torture. How every day becomes a riddle to solve. There has to be some reason, some trigger. You just haven't found it yet. And if you could just find it, then you'll be you again. You spend money on doctors and medicine and supplements and people who promise they have the magic solution that doctors don't. You would not understand how it weighs on you every day, breaking your spirit crack by crack, until you are just fragmented bits of yourself and feel like you'll never be whole again. Until you identify more with your illness than the list of things that used to define you. And so I walk. I walk when I wake up after a couple of hours of sleep, if I'm lucky. When the burn becomes too much for my sleeping brain to ignore. I open my eyes and I take inventory. I press my lips together. Do they feel puffy? I bend and extend my fingers. Do they feel tight? Do they ache? I feel my kneecaps. Are they puffy or firm? I run my fingers along my arms, torso, ass, legs, and feel the sickening bumps and bulges all over. I press down on the large welts, some as wide as softballs, hardened and sore like old bruises. As if I went to bed and the monster in my dreams managed to attack my physical body. After I take inventory, I get up. I get dressed, and I walk. It's not a calm walk. It's not tranquil. It's rushed, like I'm trying to get away from something. I walk to flush out the histamine that bombards my cells, hoping for a moment of relief from the fiery lumps and bumps that sprout all over. I walk because I'm trying to escape the thoughts in my head, the ones that tell me this must somehow be my fault. Maybe it was because I drank too much diet soda and not enough water. Or the chemicals at work, or because I was mean to Jenny Simmons. In the 3rd grade, maybe I wasn't grateful enough for my health. Whatever it was I did, I'm sorry. I truly am. I walk to escape the thoughts that endlessly go over everything I have eaten or touched, trying to pinpoint the moment that turned the switch on inside of me. Cleaning and I cut my leg. I try to outwalk the voices that tell me I'll always be alone. Because after a year, Julian and I broke up. More like we slowly drifted away until there was no choice but for me to let go. I don't resent him for it. He didn't sign up for this. He met a person who was vibrant, who loved the outdoors and going out to concerts and didn't cry multiple mornings a week slapping at her legs. At first he tried. He did. He held me and told me we would fix it. We would get answers. I believed him. Each morning he would ask me with hope, "How are you feeling?" And I had to tell him the woman he loved still wasn't better. I started hiding my body under oversized clothes so I wouldn't disappoint him. But he'd still ask. And it wasn't my fault. I know that intellectually, but in my gut, I felt somehow my inability to get better was a failing on my part. I stopped wanting to be touched, and it wasn't always because of the physical discomfort. It was because I started to feel separate from my skin. It had become a barrier between me and the world instead of the thing that connected me to it. Julian signed up for someone who loved to try new foods and restaurants, but she had become terrified to go out to eat because she was always on some new diet, hoping it would be the key. She had become someone who retreated into herself, who became obsessed with her condition, determined to find the key that would unlock the puzzle, trying to regain control of a body that had become her enemy. He had just moved in a few months before the ordeal started. It was early enough for him to start over instead of committing his life to someone who no longer existed. After a while, he stopped asking me how I was feeling. I stopped crying in his arms. He stopped promising me things would be okay. Instead, I cried alone in the cold showers that soothed the flames raging in my skin. Julian met a happy person, and then she became a sad one. I walk to outpace the voice that reminds me how I had to abandon my career because the lack of sleep, brain fog, and unpredictability of my condition made it difficult to stay alert during the day. I walk to keep ahead of the thought that tells me this will never end. I will not be one of those spontaneous remission cases, that this will always be here, and maybe I'd be better off going to sleep one day and never waking up. But most importantly, I walk to try to get away from my own skin. Like somehow if I march hard and fast enough, I can leave it behind. You might ask if a petite woman like me might be afraid of walking alone so late at night on desolate streets. But I have to walk. I just can't sit with it. And there's no villain I am more afraid of than the one inside of my own cells. For I am inside the monster, in a body that has betrayed me. So when the heat rises inside my skin and it bubbles up like a demon inside of me surfacing, trying to break through the darkest hours of the night, I walk because I must. I'd always do the same route, down a long artery that once held an old rail line, delivering to many warehouses and breweries along it. It had gone the course of many cities in the US as industry was outsourced. The businesses and the rail line atrophied until their deaths. For decades, it was a seedy area, parallel to a polluted river. And then, as these things often go, what was once helpless and decayed caught the eyes of young people looking for affordability, and the investors followed. The skeletal remains of the rail line and the old warehouses lingered. Pieces of old wooden train tracks merged with grassy slopes alongside the newly paved sidewalks. Old breweries and factories had become condos for young professionals. Footbridges that used to allow these businesses to shuttle goods to the retail district hovered high above the street. The once filthy river was being brought back to life. It had that mix of old and new, as many up-and-coming neighborhoods do. Though part of the city, since this one commercial hub had been converted to solely residential buildings, at night, it was quiet, almost barren, as if those old buildings were still just an abandoned shell and the new ones were there for show. One might see a person or two ambling about in the wee hours of the night, but mostly, it was as if the world had ended and it was just me, wandering about a half-completed urban revitalization project. It's the one time I would feel a little peace. There were no expectations, no one to fail. And if I kept going, eventually the thing that felt like it was trying to burn its way out of me would recede, almost as if it feared the light of day, until the next night, when it would try and make its maddening escape again. The night the incident went down was a particularly tough one. I had a rough day, waking up to a bad flare. The wheels hadn't really settled, so I felt inflamed and restlessly itchy all day. I had slapped and scratched and lathered myself in medicated lotions. I analyzed my food journal from days past, wondering in despair what I had done to provoke it, how I managed to anger the monster this time. But as usual, there was nothing I could pinpoint. All I could hope for was that on the following night, it wouldn't be so bad. That whatever woke up the beast had passed and that a new day might bring some relief. But when I woke up that night, it was one of the worst breakouts I had had in as long as I could remember. I shot out of bed, feeling like I had swallowed a gallon of gasoline and chased it with a match, like I had fallen asleep in a pit of fire ants. Everywhere was swollen, smoldering like thousands of tiny, hot pins prickling my skin. In a panic, I ran to the bathroom to take inventory. My lips were bee-stung and one of my eyelids was puffy. Dark circles bordered them from the choked blood vessels responding to the surge of histamine in my system. My fingers, wrists, and knees were all slightly distended from the angioedema. I ran my fingers over my skin and felt raised, firm welts of all sizes. Some of them were tender to the touch, like a days-old contusion. A wave of nausea followed, because whatever this is doesn't just attack your outsides, it attacks your insides too. Places you can't scratch or pinch. I took a deep breath, and my breathing was still okay, so at least my worst fears hadn't come to pass. It wanted to make me miserable, but it needed to keep its host alive. I didn't want to do another urgent care visit where they'd throw more steroids at me and send me home to wait for a fat bill. They don't care about my suffering. They don't think I'm suffering at all. So I sat down on the toilet lid and held my head in my hands to allow some self-pity before moving on to the next thing. Once I had calmed down a bit, I did what I always do. I chugged a bunch of water to help flush things out. I swallowed a handful of pills that might help. Then I threw on a hoodie and some tennis shoes, grabbed my keychain with mace, bade pinto beans adieu, and headed out into the chilly, early spring night, or morning, depending on your perspective. In one ear, I shoved a wireless earbud to listen to a podcast episode I had heard countless times. It served more as white noise than anything. I couldn't focus on listening to something new, not with my mind swirling. Why me? When will this end? On this night, it was unbearable. Under my skin, it was just there, persistent. That heat, those thousands of invisible pins poking me. The movement wasn't helping fast enough. Just a few minutes in, I snapped. That's why I liked it out there so late. No prying eyes to judge the lunatic smashing her fists against her legs, swatting at herself like someone who saw invisible spiders running all over her body. It had been a while since I cried over my condition. I had finally reached a point of numbness, an acceptance in as much as one can accept a thing like this. But, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit it, I did this time. Fuck you! Fuck you! I growled through gritted teeth as I pinched and punched my legs and arms, preferring pain over the maddening prickling that roved along my extremities like a subdermal millipede. I let the mini meltdown pass. That was part of the process. If I tried to suppress it, if I tried to suppress the emotional itch, it would only be worse later. I needed to just let the tears stream, and then I could collect what was left of me and move on. After a few minutes, the swell of emotions subsided, and the roaming constellation of unseen critters crawling on and under my skin seemed to ease a bit. If I could keep going, if I could move past the agony and ignore the gnawing, begging desire to stop and carve my nails along my skin, usually things might settle eventually. Movement has always been my most consistent salve. I stood back up, sniffed back the watery snot that snaked down from my sinuses, wiped away the tears from my cheeks with the sleeves of my hoodie, closed my eyes, and allowed myself one long breath cycle. Onward. The air was brisk, but the good kind, where you saw the faintest trail of steam from your breaths, the kind that felt cleansing to the lungs. The moon was bright, but hidden behind wispy navy blue clouds so that it peeked out only every now and then. I kept my eyes up, always maintaining situational awareness for the basics. Any people ahead of me or hiding in the shadows. It was desolate. Not a soul in sight. Not even a car had passed. It was nearly soundless save for my own steps and breathing, and the rustling of the hood draped over my head. I had started back up for a minute, maybe two. My body was simmering, but the cleansing tears at least lightened my load. I would get through this night, just like all the others. That's what my life had become, a battle from one night to the next. It was then I heard a noise behind me. With one ear open, I could make out in an instant what it could be. It sounded solid, heavy, and low to the ground, like steel grating against steel. A manhole cover being opened. I pulled out the earbud in my other ear as I turned to get my eyes on the source of the echoing clang. I'm not good with distance, but I guess maybe 30 yards away. I saw the manhole cover sliding over, the tinny echo of steel scraping against hard asphalt, screeching in the hollow soundscape around me. I don't know what I thought at the moment. Maybe some giant pizza-loving turtles were going to pop out. But seriously, I can't tell you if I was even scared. Not yet, at least. I was just trying to process, trying to understand why anyone would be coming out of a sewer close to 3:30 in the morning. I watched, readying myself for maybe some public works employees to climb out, as two hands, as dark and shiny as asphalt in the night rain, reached over the hole and onto the street, gripping at it with long fingers. There was something unfamiliar about the way they bent. The thick joints looked just as comfortable bending backward as they did forward. The rest of the body that belonged to those hands popped up from the manhole in one fluid motion, clearing the height of the sidewalk by at least a foot or two, and then landed on all fours, almost silent, like the gentle pat of a ballerina's slipper touching the floor. I still don't understand what I saw, so I can only paint you a picture. The thing, it was black, perhaps the blackest living being I had ever seen. If it wasn't for the street lamp by the manhole and the reflective glowing of its eyes, the only part of it that wasn't pitch black, I'm sure it would have been invisible to me in the dark. Though it was humanoid, it certainly was not human. There was something about it, maybe its face, that was adjacent to a human being, but so much of it was something else. Then as it moved into the direct path of the streetlight, and the beam roved along its body, its skin reflected it, like the multicolored sheen of an oil spill. I didn't move. I don't even think I took a breath or blinked. It hadn't seen me yet, this much I could tell, and I was terrified that even the flinch of a finger could grab its attention. On all fours, its limbs bent backward, like a spider. Then, and it took everything I had in me not to scream, When I saw this, it began to stand upright. Its leg joints jerked in the opposite direction so they would serve as bipedal knees, each one releasing a nauseating pop, like giant knuckles cracking. It had to be 10 feet tall, no shorter than 8. But its limbs were so long in proportion to its center, adding to its overall freakish size. Once fully erect, it rolled its head, small for its body, and shoulders the way you might after sitting hunched at a desk for hours. The opalescent gleam rippled along its scaly skin like a passing trail of goosebumps. Its face didn't move, but its neck, God, its neck, almost thicker than its head. It opened at the center like a vertical wound, and out of it came this trilling sound, like an insect. Its call carried down the street, bouncing off the concrete and brick structures like a binaural beat, the repetitive click ricocheting from one ear to the other. The movement of the sound inside of my skull elicited a loss of equilibrium that heightened my sense of powerlessness and panic, like the world was spinning around me, but visually, all was still. As I tried to comprehend what was unfolding, out popped another one of them, with the same power and finesse as the first. The warmth of my piss saturated my sweatpants. I had never imagined that would happen to me. How you could be so utterly terrified that your body just lets go. But I felt no shame, only terror. The third one barely poked out its head from the side of the manhole as if it was latched to the ceiling of the sewer. It tilted its head to the side inquisitively and then scurried out and over the lip of the opening until it was right side up on the street. That one made that awful sound again from its throat, the one that made my thoughts swim, and that disorienting feeling snapped me out of my stupor. I finally was in my body and mind enough to think. Standing there, out on the sidewalk, wasn't tenable. I had to hide, but I couldn't run. That would bring too much attention to me. I had to move slowly, so slowly that whatever these things were, they wouldn't hear me or even sense movement. And I had to do that with my heart racing as if I had just sprinted the 400-meter in the Olympics. All the while, every muscle in my body twitched, vibrating with adrenaline. I took a half step back. There was a footbridge overhead just a few steps away, and I could try and sneak into the shadows underneath it. It was maybe 10 steps, but those 10 steps, at the time, might as well have been miles. I think I got 2, maybe 3 in, when one sniffed the air, searching. Oh no. As soon as those words crossed my mind, the fluttering of its facial muscles stopped and the creature became as still as the night. I almost was able to wonder to myself if it had given up. But before I could even fully examine that thought, as if they shared some sort of collective consciousness, all 3 of the dark beings sharply turned and looked directly at me. The kaleidoscopic reflection cascaded along their bodies in a flash. I couldn't move. My muscles had all disconnected from my thoughts as I stood there soaked in my own urine. I guess my reptilian brain thought that my best chance for survival was not to stimulate their chase reflex. Clearly, based on their physical abilities, I would have no chance outrunning them, and I sure as hell wasn't going to charge them. Freeze, my animal brain wagered. I don't know. I don't think there was a right choice, so I'm not going to judge myself too harshly on that. But the things, they angled their heads, curious-like, and looked at each other. Without a screech, a throat click, or any sort of sound, the three simultaneously broke out into a run. The one at the center falling back down on all fours as its limbs readjusted, cracking and popping. The two others fanned out in opposite directions. The one at the center, however, started skittering straight at me. They started so abruptly, it took longer than it should have for me to react. Somewhere in my years of existence on this earth, maybe I picked it up from a movie or nature show, the information had been filed away, deemed useless. But in the nanosecond I needed to pull out that knowledge, it presented itself to me. I knew that the formation they took meant I was being hunted. With that realization, like an electric shock to an unstable heart, I became in sync with my body again. Freeze was not going to cut it. It was time for flight. I turned and ran as hard as I could into the darkness underneath the footbridge, running up the slanted concrete. But I couldn't stop there and wait in the shadows. Once in flight mode, I couldn't stop. My legs and arms just kept pumping. Get away was all I could think. The skittering of its legs got louder as the one making the beeline closed in on me. Then, like a giant, loud angel on wheels, it appeared. A city bus barreling down the street directly towards it. I waved my arms and shouted, but I don't think the driver even saw me. What did happen, what bought me just a few extra, much-needed seconds, was that this thing backed away from it, scurrying into the shadows. Completely invisible when the light wasn't touching it. I didn't hesitate to keep running up the steep slant, my thighs and lungs searing from the strain, until I reached the end of the concrete and hit the grassy slope bordering it. I knew at the very top of the grassy hill there was a park. It was a quiet one. Even during daylight hours, there were many better options, and so people didn't come here too often. It was a huge, relatively unkempt field with a basic playground on one end. Bordering it, there were bushes and brush all around that I could duck into. As I reached the top, I saw out in the distance, as the moon peered out of the clouds, the figure of one of the beings, creeping between two empty swings. They drifted back and forth, and as the shadow of one of the swings moved along its body, a flickering of its scaly skin followed in its wake as a sliver of moonlight touched it. It turned its head, surveying the empty field. The amount of ground it covered in just a few steps was terrifying, and I plunged myself fully into the tall grass on the edge of the park. I waited on my back, painfully sucking in air as I replenished my oxygen. I shut my eyes tight, hoping, praying these things would quit. The dry grass all around me hissed as the wind blew. There were no clicks, no sounds of fluttering legs. Maybe they had left, I thought. But then I heard their vocalizations echoing over the empty flat land. They used different rhythms and inflections like a language. They might have just sounded like a part of nature, like giant cicadas at sunset. If not for the way it all swirled inside of my head, their sounds were like a weapon, inciting a type of motionless motion sickness. I knew they were strategizing. What would they do to me if they found me? I wondered. Would they tear me from limb to limb? What else could they possibly want but to consume me? As much as I hated my life, dreaded every fucking time I closed my eyes and went to bed. I didn't want it to end. Not yet. Shit sucked, but I didn't want to go. As much as I had thought, I had stopped hoping. There was always a faded spark in me that wouldn't extinguish. I tried to orient myself in my surroundings. If I could stay hidden in the tall grass, maybe I could crawl out. But I didn't know their full abilities. Could they hear me? Could they smell me? If so, from what distance? I had no real knowledge. Any decision was an uneducated gamble. But that's how it often is, isn't it? You're either lucky or you aren't. Slowly, I rolled onto my belly. I waited for any sound from them, but they stayed silent. So I put one arm in front of the other and started a tediously slow trench crawl. One arm, one leg. One arm, one leg. I waited. Nothing. Okay, maybe I can do this. I could get out. So again, one arm, one leg. One arm, one leg. Maybe the high grass shielded me from their noses. Maybe the sound of the blades rustling in the wind helped disguise my tiny movements. Maybe you think right now, I am telling you this story from a place of victory. I guess in the end, that's up for your interpretation. But you might have forgotten. There were two types of monsters I had been running from that night. Those dark, obsidian-skinned things out there. And myself. And while those sewer monsters didn't have me yet, the one inside of me took the opportunity to attack. It could have been the panic or the fact that I was surrounded by brush, home to all kinds of irritants, allergens, and bugs that would love to get a taste. Maybe all of the above. But as I learned long ago, trying to decipher a cause was a hopeless endeavor because it was here regardless. The burning, the tingling, the wheels rising all across my body. No, I pleaded under my breath. But the hives? Fuck it. I could push past them to save my life. What I couldn't do was ignore the swelling that up until this point had spared me its worst, isolating itself to my lips and my joints. I had always tried to practice gratitude. However miserable this condition made me, at least it wasn't this or that. And one of the things I had been grateful for, one thing that kept me from completely quitting, was that the swelling had never spread to the inside of my mouth and throat. There were people out there who suffered like me, who found themselves unable to breathe, choked out by a mystery. I wasn't one of those people, at least. Well, not until that moment. I trembled as tears flowed down my face and onto the earth below me. My tongue and lips had a strange sensation, a mix of numbness, but also like hundreds of phantom pins were poking at them. My fingers started to distend even more, the little folds of skin on my knuckles turning smooth, stretched. My chest felt rigid and tight, and with each breath it felt like my lungs were taking air through a strainer. I was going into anaphylactic shock. If these creatures wouldn't kill me, my own fucking body would. I attempted to slow my breathing, a difficult task as the terror of my impossible situation sent my heart rate into a frenzy. I raised my fingers to my lips to take the usual inventory, as I always had, and they felt like bags of water. My tongue started expanding, trying to take up all the space in my mouth. My survival against the things that were hunting me depended on my silence. But as my throat tightened and each breath drew less air, I had no choice but to suck in as hard as I could. Again, I rolled onto my back and stared up at the night sky. My eyes stung and my vision was cloudy, but I could still see it. There were no stars. The moon had receded behind the clouds. It was all black, just like their skin. It was so quiet while I lay there, my body letting me down once again. This time, for good. Of the two things trying to kill me, it had become the bigger threat. So I sucked in air. I stopped caring, at least for that moment, about the things that crawled in the night. I would kill me before they did. The wind stopped, and with it, the sound of grass rattling in the breeze. All I could hear was my own wheezing, the pitch of it heightening as my airways narrowed. I had to use my last breaths to move forward. Hidden in there, I would die for certain. Dying creates a biological desperation you wouldn't understand until you faced it. Just as your body will force you to surface a body of water for air, my body demanded I surface out of that grass. The grass was absolute death. Out there was uncertainty. And that uncertainty was the best option in an insurmountable circumstance. Maybe those things were gone. Maybe they had lost interest, moved on to some other poor night walker. Maybe I could manage to get back down to the street and lie in the middle of it. Soon the early shift would be hitting the road, and maybe someone would find me before it was too late. At that point, I had nothing to lose. I rolled back onto my stomach, and with each weak, fading breath, I put one arm ahead, one leg, one arm, one leg. They felt so heavy. My vision slowly tunneled as the skin around my eyes swelled. I was probably only feet away from the open field, but it was an odyssey just to get out there. Finally, I felt the rush of cool air on my face. But it meant nothing. Salvation was still so far. The clicking sound. Even in my diminished state, deep in that fog, I could hear it, how it bounced from one ear to the other as if physically running through my brain, how it echoed inside of my body. I was scared. I don't want you to think I wasn't, but I guess I had accepted that I would die. And in that, there was a peace that only comes with surrender. Like a fly caught in a spider's web, I felt the vibration of their double-jointed legs scurrying along the field, its intensity strengthening as they closed in on me. I was drowning, while surrounded by air. I grabbed at my throat with rigid, swollen fingers. It's something you know will accomplish nothing, but you just lean on instinct. And it's strange how your own body will destroy itself and fight to survive at the same time. They were looking down on me in seconds, their speed at their enormous size defying physics. One grabbed the back of my hoodie, flipped me onto my back. I braced for death, for it to gut me or rip my head off or stab right through me with its limbs. But nothing. Just more of that horrific clicking over my limp body, like they were consulting with each other. I wish I could explain my thought process, why I said what I said. It was just survival. It was the most essential organ of the human body, its CPU, trying to override its broken software. Thinking back, it seems inconceivable, like a waste of precious breath. The word barely made it out of my bloated throat. You know, it's really fucking bad when you beg the horror movie monsters that have been hunting you. The thing, and I think it was the leader, though that's just a guess because they all look the same to me, stopped communicating with the others and tilted its head. It looked down so close, like an inch away from me, and it scrunched its pitch-black face, sniffing me up and down, the guttural clicking hitting a steady rhythm, its throat hole quivering in sync. And this time, the anaphylaxis commenced its final stage. Breathing was no longer labored and exhausting. It was becoming downright impossible. My vision was like looking through a peephole. That's when I started to thrash, gasping desperately for precious oxygen, pulling at the neck of my hoodie with fingers that could hardly bend. The thing pulled away from me. I stopped paying attention to what they were doing. It was irrelevant. I was dying. I knew it. This was the end. I don't understand it. I may never. But the thing picked me up like I was nothing, scooped me right up like a fucking baby. And out of its second mouth, the one on its face, not the throat hole, was this fluid. Its consistency, mucus-like, it drizzled down onto my inflamed lips. It was rancid, the most disgusting thing I had ever tasted. Have you ever tasted something so utterly awful that goosebumps rise all over your body and you seize up because it's just so overwhelming? It was like that, but worse. This goopy, putrid saliva that I can't describe or relate to anything I have ever tasted seeped into my mouth. I started choking on it as it meandered past my oversized tongue and down my throat. I just hung there in its grip, too weak to fully react to the disgusting taste and smell. It was torture. But seconds later, I felt something change. Air was finding its way into my lungs again. It was that feeling when you hold your breath too long underwater and get that precious first gasp of air, but multiply that infinitely. Oxygen, the bringer of life, was returning to my lungs. It was a miracle, an unlikely moment of relief. But then, pretty much as soon as I could breathe a little, a burning started inside of me and all over my skin. It was similar to when the hives were at their worst, but as if someone found a way to harness it and deliver it 10,000 times over. This thing had not helped me, it poisoned me. Maybe this was what it had planned to do all along. I screamed, or rather I rehearsed the screaming muscles because everything was misfiring. It was lodged inside of me and had to be forced through this tiny hole. It made this awful sound, like a death rattle. The flames inside of me raged on, building to a type of pain that even just speaking about it now makes my heart race and my stomach sick. It's gone and I don't feel it now, but just the thought of it. I writhed in its arms and honestly wished for the death that my body had promised. Because this, whatever these monsters were doing to me, it was excruciating. It was cruel. I was their plaything, like a little mouse trapped by a gang of cats. The thing then dropped me back on the ground with a weak thud. It ripped all my clothes off. I was too consumed with agony to even venture to guess what was to come. But that's what allowed me to see the state of my skin. It looked like a rolling boil. Bumps and blisters were rising and deflating all over, like a time lapse of my skin during these past 3 years. But each new welt or bump was worse than the one before it. The skin turned darker. I was being cooked alive from the inside, and the agony was inescapable. I rolled in the grass, wheezing and choking, this time from the pain, as they watched and did nothing. I contorted into twisted shapes, trying to find some relief in the damp grass of the field. But the pain was inescapable. My skin, it started to pull away like it was detaching itself from me. In some sick fucking way, I was finally getting my wish. And it was a horror. It was such a horror. It started to peel away from my body, but not in pieces or shreds. The whole organ maintained its continuity. My entire body was being degloved. Even the skin on my face and lips began to detach, and I just knew what to do, just like a snake knows. Arms at my side, I rolled onto my stomach and started to slither on my belly as the skin on the top of my scalp gave way. As I made forward progress, I started sliding out of my diseased, toxic sheath, inch by inch. It was not easy. Every second of it was grueling. Every moment of pain was relentless. But it was necessary. A metamorphosis. You know what I remember most? That damp grass. I could finally smell it again because I could breathe a bit more. Even now, when I smell wet grass, I see a flash of myself, as if watching from the outside of my body, wriggling out of my desiccated skin. Through the suffering, that's what kept me going. The scent of renewal, until I was completely free of it. The only movement I could summon was to look down at my feet, and there it was. A hollow, crisp shape of me, except for the giant hole at the top from which I escaped. My skin, it was all gone. I was raw, wet, glistening. I felt every moment of being skinned alive. The thing, it stood over me and vomited that same repulsive saliva all over my body, dousing me in its dizzying, disgusting scent. As the sludge contacted the raw, exposed muscles, connective tissues, and layers of subdermal fat, they hissed and sizzled. Faint wisps of steam rose wherever the slime touched. The pain reached a peak so strong, I would lapse in and out of consciousness. Then suddenly, the agony stopped. Completely. Relief swept down like a cool rush of fresh spring water. I wish I could explain how good it felt. Orgasmic is the only word I can think of. I didn't just feel better than I had since they skinned me. I had felt better than I had in 3 years, since that first night my body turned on me. There was no ever-present sensation lurking from inside, but I was so exhausted that the shock of such a blissful feeling was overwhelming. All I could do was lie there as they scampered over to my shed skin, the hollow sheath that was once part of me, and feasted on it. Running or even thanking them was not an option. I had nothing left. Every bit of adrenaline in my body had been spent shedding my skin. Just like those nature shows when the prey has run out of energy and seems to submit to their demise. If I would die, at least now, I felt peace. A moment of true serenity, one I hadn't felt in years. A warmth swept over me like a soft blanket. I drifted off to the sounds of them chewing, tearing, crunching on my skin. Someone found me, lying naked in that field a few hours later. Their dog came upon me, and of course they called an ambulance. I woke up in a hospital. It was the first time in 3 years I awoke from a slumber without my body covered in painful, burning hives. I spoke to the staff, to the police as they tried to make sense of how I ended up in that park. The irony of it all was that I was perfectly healthy by the time they found me. Not even a single scratch. My skin as fresh and new as an infant's. Of course, they thought I had a mental breakdown, that I sleepwalked out of bed in the middle of the night and onto the field, stripped off my clothes, and settled where they found me. You see, I had been sleep deprived for years, and that kind of thing takes its toll. My health problems, my relationship problems, the crushing loneliness. Sometimes you reach a breaking point. I tried to throw a little hint here or there. What if I had seen something? Had anyone reported seeing anything coming out of the sewer that night? Tall, black, its skin flickering under the light like an oil slick? They nodded and wrote things down, confirming their theory about me. It was all a nightmare, a hallucination, induced by stress and, of course, insomnia. Listen, I get it. I get why that was the only plausible answer. I was sent home with orders to see a psychiatrist, and after going to therapy, I started to believe it. That there were no monsters. At least not anything outside of me. I wasn't chased. It was all a hallucination. It makes sense. It was a particularly bad night. The kind that would send someone over the edge. I thought I had snapped. That in that space between wake and sleep, there was a reckoning of the mind and body where one was going to win. Either I beat this thing or it kills me. But here's the thing. It's been about 2 years. Slowly, I have started building my life back. I met a wonderful guy and we're taking it slow. I'm still messed up over how things happened with Julian. It's hard to trust someone to love you again when illness proves how thin love can be when it's tested. but he stays over a lot, and we wake up in the morning and there are no hives. There are no more late-night frantic walks. There is no crying or slapping or disappointment. I was a sad girl. Now, I am a happy one. But these past few weeks, I have been waking up in the middle of the night. It's nothing physical. It's that I swear I can hear that clicking. I can't tell if it's in a dream or the real world. When I wake up like that, it feels like they're calling me. Like I'm being beckoned. I feel a pull in the same way I just knew I had to crawl out of my old skin. Then something new happened last night, and I'm a little scared because I don't want to lose it all again. I woke up, I felt a sensation on my arm, not burning or itching, but an awareness of that spot. Of course, I panicked because I'm fucking traumatized. It's something that can return as mysteriously as it vanished. But when I went into the bathroom, before I turned on the light, the spot where I felt it, the moonlight from the window, it shined on my forearm, and I swear it glimmered with that oily iridescence. The opalescent greens, purples, and silvers bleeding into each other, just like how their pitch black skin shimmered that night. I blinked and then nothing was there, just my human skin. But I'm afraid. I'm afraid that what they did doesn't come for free. That my new skin isn't done. I think what I see in the mirror now is the midpoint. I don't want to go back out there. I don't want to answer their call. But I think there may come a time when I don't have a choice.